Welcome to Indus Special. I'm Ejaz Haider. Now that she's leaving office, Alice Wells, the Trump administration's outgoing point person for South and Central Asia, says US-Taliban talks weren't possible without Pakistan's solid cooperation. We have seen over the last year solid cooperation between Ambassador Khalilzad and the Pakistani civilian and military leadership to encourage the Taliban to take steps to reach the negotiating table. She was speaking at an online media briefing reviewing US policies in the region during the past 3 years. The advancement and improvement and the foundation for a stronger US-Pakistan partnership is premised on our ability to work together constructively to advance peace. Let's dive straight into her remarks in view of a number of mistakes the US and its allies made since the invasion of Afghanistan, mistakes that have been well documented by a number of analysts, including Western diplomats, generals and leaders, US reps and others. Most are known. Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, a US government oversight agency, has put out a number of reports detailing the misconduct of both war and the efforts for peace. It's probably instructive to go back to where it began after the US ousted the Taliban. So we are joined today by Michael Kugelman, who is at the Wilson Center. We also have with us Ambassador Aziz Khan and Dr. Rifaat Hussain, who teaches at NUST. Let me begin with Ambassador Khan because, as I said, let's go back a little in time. And this was a time when Ambassador Khan was our ambassador to Afghanistan. Ambassador Khan, give us a quick rerun of the US invasion, Pakistan's position that any new dispensation should involve in negotiations with those Taliban that are prepared to lay down arms and actually become part of a new political configuration, things that the US did not accept at that time.
At that particular time, when the invasion was imminent, just before the invasion, the US attack started, we had had extensive discussions with the Taliban also and tried to see if some kind of a solution can be found without hostilities, but it didn't work out. And after that, once the Taliban had been ousted, before the Bonn process, we strongly felt and recommended that Taliban should be made part of this process, because they are a party in Afghanistan and a very strong party. So we were a bit disappointed when they were not included in the Bonn process. And the consequences of that, we see it today. Had they been included, and our own assessment was that the Taliban, or at least a large element of the Taliban, would be willing to join the process.
Okay, so was the initial Bonn process. And then there was another opportunity in 2003, and then yet another opportunity in 2004. But nothing was really done to pull the Taliban in.
Yes, I think at one point, even President Karzai, who had become interim president after the Bonn process, had talked about it and had even made a statement that those who wish to give up arms and join the process would be most welcome. But my guesswork is that he probably met with the US displeasure, because he retracted that statement the following day. So there were efforts and there was a desire that Taliban should be made a part of this process.
Okay, thank you so much. That was Ambassador Aziz Ahmed Khan speaking with us. Let me go to Michael Kugelman. Michael, I've been doing programs on this, US-Taliban talks. Even within the US policy community, there are kind of differences in terms of, there's some people who say that the Afghanistan government should have been made part of the process. There are others who say, well, that wasn't possible in the first phase. Where do you stand on that debate?
Well, I think that it was really the only option. It was clear, or it has been clear, that this war cannot be won militarily. There needs to be a negotiation to end it. And it was clear that the only way that the Taliban was going to be willing to begin a process, hopefully leading to an inter-Afghan dialogue and formal talks between the Afghan government and the Taliban, was to have bilateral discussions, negotiations with the United States only. And certainly it is very problematic, especially now, given that you have an agreement between the U.S. and the Taliban that is, I would argue, overly generous to the Taliban. It commits the Afghan government to doing a number of things that it would not have wanted to do and probably would have refused had it been involved in the negotiations. But again, this is the only option. And I had been skeptical about the idea of talks. I still am. I'm not sure if we can trust the Taliban to hold up its end of the bargain. But this is a horrible war that has just gotten worse. There have been all kinds of records broken in recent years in terms of casualty levels and that type of thing. So I think the time is now to have these negotiations however possible. And it is true, to your point, Ejaz, that in previous years during the Obama administration, there had been opportunities for the U.S. to launch talks with the Taliban. But at that point, the Obama administration refused to do so unless the Afghan government was involved as well. But things are different now in that the Trump administration has been willing to move forward, or had been willing to move forward with talks with the Taliban and without Kabul. But of course, now we get to the harder point of this whole process where we try to launch this, to this point, elusive intra-Afghan dialogue.
Okay, so finally, on 16th May, a few days ago that is, there was an agreement between Abdullah and President Ashraf Ghani. And now, Abdullah, who The Economist calls somewhat cheekily the eternal rival for the job, is now the person who's going to actually talk to the Taliban. Do you think that is something which, I mean, that Ashraf Ghani has actually thrown Abdullah at the deep end?
Certainly is a possibility. Well, look, the Taliban has consistently said that it will not talk with Ghani, who it views as a particularly overt stooge of the United States and the U.S. government. So perhaps having Abdullah in charge of this process, that'll make it a bit more likely that we can get these talks off the ground. Certainly, even though that you have this deal between Abdullah and Ghani now, these two gentlemen are still very fierce rivals. So, who knows the real reasoning behind this arrangement to have Abdullah heading up the peace talks? But I see it as a good thing. But of course, now the bigger question is getting the mood back to the point where the Afghan government is willing to sit down with the Taliban, because, as you know, events of the last 7 to 10 days suggest that, at least for the near term, the Afghan government is not in a mood to sit down with the Taliban, having relaunched offensives against the Taliban and so on.
Yeah, okay. Let me pull Rifaat Hussain here. Dr. Hussain, give me your reading of the situation, all things told. I mean, there are not too many good options on the ground for the US or for the Afghan government. But the Taliban have also, they have a point when they say, well, there was an agreement in terms for the intra-Afghan dialogue, and that was contingent on the release of prisoners. Now, some of the prisoners have been released on both sides, but the Afghan government is still dithering over the entire process per se. In fact, Ashraf Ghani had initially said that he's not going to release the prisoners because he's not a party to this. So give me a reading of the situation as it stands, and whether you think that it's likely to go the positive way, or there could be some reversals.
Thank you, Ejaz. I think the critical factor would be the Afghan public disavowal of their links with the old Al-Qaeda or some form of terrorism that exists in the country. And, given the fact that the Taliban are very reluctant to snap their links with the Al-Qaeda forces, even though they have been defeated, they have been marginalized, but still the links are there. And the latest report by the AG office talks about this, and they are even pointing fingers in the direction of Pakistan, that Pakistan is keeping its links alive with the Haqqani group. Now, given that situation, I do not think that that the Americans, even though they have got the Taliban to agree that they will snap their links, they will break their links with the Al-Qaeda. But Al-Qaeda may have gone underground, and the Taliban are likely to revive their links with the remnants of Al-Qaeda. That's one sticking point. The other, of course, is the whole question of the Afghan prisoners. I think sooner or later the Afghan government and indeed all the parties to the conflict will have no choice but to release the prisoners. So the prisoner swap is very much on track. And the third difficulty is how do you commence the intra-Afghan dialogue, which is the next phase of the process. The Taliban have made it clear that they do not want to talk to only the regime in Kabul, whether that's Abdullah or that's the unity government headed by Ashraf Ghani. They would like to have some kind of a representative figures, including the Afghan government, and then they will be and those credible forces, unless they are put in the form of a delegation.
So right now,
right
now, the delegation that was put together does have people from the political opposition, but they're not the heavyweights.
Yes, of course. And then the entire question is that, would the Taliban be willing to compromise on their commitment to establish an Islamic Emirate in Afghanistan? And, yesterday there was some reference to Taliban leaders' commitment that, they would like to establish an Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. So yes. In the Taliban search for peace, the model that they are trying to develop, would that model be acceptable to the Ghani or Abdullah dispensation? That is something which remains to be seen. So, given all these difficulties, I do not think that this is going to be an easy ride for the as far as the peace process is concerned, and most importantly, the ground reality, which means that the Taliban's actual and operational control over large parts of Afghanistan will be the key factor, and Taliban seem to have an upper hand in that regard.
Absolutely. Thank you. That was Dr. Rifaat Hussain. Back to Michael very quickly before I wrap up this segment. Michael, in many ways, Afghanistan, especially urban Afghanistan, has come a long way since the U.S. invasion. There's an entire generation now, the women and so on and so forth. So it seems to me, and I think it makes eminent sense, that the next configuration, if with the Taliban included in that, actually looks at the Afghan constitution in an inclusive manner and not simply on the basis of Sharia. And also the interpretation of that Sharia, which is a specific Taliban interpretation.
Well, this is one of the many questions, as was outlined by my friend Dr. Rifaat, one of the many uncertainties as to how things could develop. All of its messaging, all of the Taliban's messaging has been very positive and encouraging, in which it said that everyone will have rights, men and women. There is an Eid message delivered by Mullah Akhundzada, the head of the Taliban, in which he said all men and women will have equal rights. Consistently, the messaging has been that basically anything is possible so long as it follows Islamic law, but that's a very vague pronouncement right there. There's some that say that the Taliban is more moderate than it used to be, a younger generation, more willing to be more progressive. But quite frankly, the track record is not very good. So I really do worry about what Afghanistan could look like if we look to the day where the Taliban holds some level of power, if not outright power.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Michael Kugelman, speaking with us. We shall take a short break and return to discuss U.S. sale of heavy torpedoes to Taiwan, a decision that has drawn sharp criticism from China. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. U.S. State Department has approved the sale of 18 Mk-48 Mod 6 advanced technology heavyweight torpedoes and related equipment for an estimated $180 million to the island of Taiwan, Reuters reported on Thursday. The report has drawn sharp criticism from China. The country's foreign ministry spokesperson said the U.S. must abide by the One China principle, and the three China-U.S. joint communiques canceled the plan of arms sale to Taiwan and end its military link with the island before it causes more harm to U.S.-China ties and peace and stability across the Taiwan Straits. Chinese military experts say the sale is overpriced and will not enhance Taiwan's capability significantly, while the torpedoes are an advanced weapon system. Taiwan's submarines are not. And in case of a conflict, People's Liberation Army Navy could easily locate and destroy the subs before they could use the torpedoes. However, neutral observers say Taiwan's vulnerability stems from Beijing's aggressive posturing. Beijing has escalated the number and intensity of military drills around the island in recent months, including a 36-hour Air Force endurance exercise in April and a first-ever Air Force nighttime drill in March. Taiwan has also just sworn in Tsai Ing-wen as president for the second time. Ing-wen is an old hand in cross-strait relations, and while she's firm on the issue of Taiwan's sovereignty, she is in no mood to press the wrong buttons. To discuss the situation, we are joined by Professor Elizabeth Larus, who's a professor of political science and international affairs at the University of Mary Washington, and Ross Feingold, who's a political risk analyst and advises clients on risk mitigation in Asia. He joins us from Taipei. Let me begin with Professor Larus here. Professor Larus, what's the point of these torpedoes? I mean, they're not really going to enhance significantly the Taiwanese military capability, but they're certainly going to add a further thorn in the sides of Sino-US relations.
18 torpedoes on 2 subs are not going to change Taiwan's operational capabilities. More important is the political signal that it sends that the United States is committed to the defense of a longtime democratic ally.
Okay.
As you mentioned, China has become more assertive around Taiwan, and the United States, especially in this environment of deteriorating U.S.-China relations, is sending a strong message to China that we are committed to peace and security in the Asia-Pacific. Notice that the arms sales were announced on the day of Tsai Ing-wen's inauguration. So that was a political calculation. At the same time, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo sent congratulatory message to President Tsai Ing-wen, as did White House Deputy National Security Advisor Matt Pottinger in Mandarin. Speaker of the U.S. House, Nancy Pelosi, also sent a message. So this is certainly political. And we cannot deny that these torpedoes are at least advanced weapons systems. Taiwan certainly would need a lot more submarines to be able to have 2 or 3 out at any one time to really use them as some type of a security measure. But again, this is more of a political message than an operational decision.
Great. I agree with you, Larry. Here's the point. The political messaging comes at a time when overall tenor of Sino-US relations is not looking up. Also, if we look at it in terms of neorealism, I mean, this is a rising power which is going to create its own Monroe Doctrine in the area. I mean, this area, whether it's South China Sea or East China Sea, this is China's near abroad. So are we then looking at what Graham Allison called the Thucydides trap? I mean, are we looking at the possibility of some kind of miscalculation and a clash at some point between China and the United States?
As the particularly South China Sea and the Pacific becomes more crowded, with the U.S. carrying out freedom of navigation operations, the UK is also carrying them out, Japan is carrying them out. Yes, there's greater chance for an accident at sea. But remember that the United States is legally committed to help Taiwan defend itself. The 1979 Taiwan Relations Act commits the United States to help Taiwan defend itself. How does it do that? It sells arms to Taiwan. And so the United States, every administration since then, has sent arms to Taiwan. As a matter of fact, this is the 6th announced arms sale in 4 years. President Trump was inaugurated in 2017, and he followed up with arms sales in 2017, 2018, and last year, 3 or 4 announced arms sales. I certainly can see your point about accidents at sea, but again, the United States is obligated. And our 2019 and 2020 National Defense Authorization Act calls for more formalized, more regularized, I should say, more regularized military-to-military cooperation between the United States and Taiwan. So the United States needs to follow through and carry out on this. The way, the Obama administration had announced a pivot to the Asia Pacific and didn't really carry through. So that looked like, empty promises, and China was quite aware of that. So the Trump administration is signaling that it's willing to carry through, despite the risks.
Right. Stay with me, Professor. Let me hop over to Ross Feingold here. Ms. Feingold, give me your reading of the situation.
Well, the new government of Tsai Ing-wen, having just been sworn in, as you mentioned, has an enormous amount of political capital, both with the public in Taiwan, as well as with the United States government. They certainly have common views on a number of issues, and specifically with regard to China. So for the government here to spend some of that political capital by spending some taxpayer money on additional weapons purchases comes as no surprise. So we've been discussing the government reasons, whether it was the United States government or the response from China. But we should keep in mind the public here in Taiwan as well. And I think given the state of relations between Taiwan and China, the public here in Taiwan is very supportive of additional weapon sales. That certainly shouldn't be read to mean that they're eager to have a military conflict with China. But when it comes to spending money on more weapon systems, if the United States is willing to sell, then I think the public here is going to be supportive of that. And there's another reality here, which is, frankly, very few other governments are willing to assist Taiwan in this way. There was one announcement recently that France is selling a weapon system or an upgrade of a system to Taiwan. But other than that, the United States really is the only option. So if the United States is a willing seller, then Taiwan's going to be a willing buyer.
Well, talking about the taxpayers, and of course it is up to the Taiwanese journalists to actually look into this, but reports suggest that this sale is really overpriced. And so, one torpedo, which should have been sold for $3.1 million, is being sold for $10 million. So anyway, as I said, that's something the Taiwanese have to look into. But as Professor Larus said, this is political signaling. What you're saying, there's a seller, there's a happy buyer, so the sale will go through. But there is the larger issue of Sino-US relations. Now, the treaty that obligates the US to remain in support of Taiwan was inked at a time when China was not really a threat per se. It did not have the heft that it has today, and that heft is going to grow. So to that extent, is there any other way of dealing with this rather than arming Taiwan, which obviously could get a reaction from China?
Well, the easy answer to your question would be to say that China should reduce the threats, to not have missiles pointed at Taiwan, to not conduct increasing number of military exercises that causes the government and the people of Taiwan to feel they are under threat, and thus they need to purchase additional weapon systems. Oh, like I said, that's the easy answer. Obviously, China is not going to do that. They've made it very clear that, in their view, Taiwan should be a part of the People's Republic of China, and they haven't renounced the use of force to make that a reality at some point in the future. And obviously, they're increasingly showing that they are willing to use force. So the people and the government of Taiwan, or other countries in the region, and also the United States, shouldn't underestimate the seriousness of this threat from China. So if that threat is not going to go away, then it's understandable, as we've been discussing, that there'd be a willing buyer, the Taiwan government and military, if the United States is a willing seller. Also, it's important to keep in mind that you referred to it as a treaty, but actually it's a U.S. law, so it's a bit distinguished from a treaty. It's a domestic U.S. law. It's somewhat unique in that regard, but it obligates the government of the United States, doesn't matter if it's a Republican or a Democrat in the White House or which party controls Congress, it obligates the United States government to sell weapons to Taiwan. And I don't think any U.S. government, and especially the Trump administration, wants to be accused of violating this particular law. Thus, they seek to fulfill the requirements of the law and sell weapons to Taiwan as long as Taiwan is willing to appropriate the budgets to make those purchases.
Okay. Thank you so much. Ross Feingold speaking with us. Before I wrap up the segment, let me quickly go back to Professor Larus. Professor Larus, so domestic law, but there are external ground realities in terms of, as I said to Feingold also, China's increasing heft. Do you think there is another way in which this thing can be sorted out, or are we necessarily getting into the securities trap that I mentioned earlier?
Maritime security in the Asia-Pacific is extremely important to the United States. So supporting Taiwan's national defense is also very important to the United States keeping its dominant position in the Asia-Pacific. So the United States is going to do what it needs to do to make sure that it remains the dominant player and that China does not become the maritime hegemon in the Asia-Pacific. Supporting Taiwan helps the United States prevent China from exercising its maritime power out to what's called the First Island Chain, which runs from southern Japan, includes Taiwan, past the Philippines, down to Malaysia. So if you could visualize all that maritime area between coastal China and out to Taiwan, that is what China has claimed it wants to control. And the United States has a huge stake in not allowing China to control that maritime area. China is trying to displace the United States from the Asia-Pacific. The United States needs Taiwan as our eyes, as our ears, potentially as a security asset, as a military asset in the region. So no, I do not see this equation changing anytime soon. Again, the United States has been the dominant maritime power in the Asia-Pacific since the end of World War II, and the United States government wants to keep it that way.
Well, the straitjacket of realism. Thank you so much. That was Professor Elizabeth Larus speaking with us. We'll take a short break and return to discuss the deteriorating relations between Nepal and India. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. Nepal has published a new political map that includes a small stretch of disputed land, toughening its stance on a decades-long row over the territory with India, which has rejected the move. The new map that shows a sliver of land, including Limpiadhura, Lipulekh, and Kalapani, jutting out from the northwestern tip of Nepal, was made public on Wednesday by Land Management Minister Padma Aryal, who said the occasion was historically pleasant for Nepal and its people. India has bitterly criticized and rejected the move. Do note that India has recently issued bogus and illegal maps showing occupied Jammu and Kashmir, as also the liberated areas of Azad Kashmir and Gilgit-Baltistan as part of India. For his part, Nepalese Prime Minister KP Oli has also angered India by saying that Indians are spreading COVID-19 in Nepal, and the Indian strain is more virulent than Chinese and Italian strains. To discuss this further, let's get to our experts. We are joined by Mr. Nishant Verma, who's an analyst, and Tika P. Dhakal, who is a PhD scholar in political science and joins me from Kathmandu in Nepal. Now, there are two sides to this story. As I was researching for this program, I've come across views. Views from Nepal are very different from views in India. So let's first hear the two sides of the story, starting with Mr. Dhakal.
The problem actually is a residue of history. And it goes as far back as to 1816, when Nepal fought a war with British colonial powers. We had a treaty called Treaty of Sugoli that was signed, and accordingly, Nepal's current international boundaries were decided. Mm-hmm. In the east, there is a Mechi River that separates Nepal and India. In the west, there is Kali River, which we call Mahakali here in Nepal. Kali River, that separates Nepal and India. in 1860, there was another treaty between Nepal and British East India Company, which brought 4 more districts to Nepal by, of course, on the basis of that treaty. Baket, Bardia, Kailali, and Kanchanpur, these 4 districts were added into Nepal. So that is the current international boundary Nepal has. Now, the source of the problem is that the shores of River Kali, we say here in Nepal on the basis of historical facts, on the basis of the maps published, official maps published by British East India Company, and on the basis of the official archives, on the basis of the historic records, that the origin of River Kali is from the place called Limpiadhura that you just mentioned at the start. So Limpiadhura is the original headwaters, which was supposed to be the tri-junction point between India, Nepal, and China, there in the Himalayas. So that is where that is how the Nepalis have been claiming for so many years, for several years. And in the middle, then there were several political changes, and in 1962, when there was a war between India and China, in a place called Kalapani that you also mentioned in your starting comment, that a Indian military post was situated there in 1962 that still is there. Since then, Nepal continuously has been saying that Kalapani and the area has been ours. Nepal has been presenting the historical facts. Nepal has been presenting the historic claims. And
Okay.
Nepal has been urging India
I get your point, Mr. Dhakal. I get your point. Let me go to Mr. Verma, and then I have a couple of questions. Mr. Verma.
Thank you. I'll keep it very simple. I do not see this as something very surprising coming from Mr. K.P. Sharma Oli, the Prime Minister of Nepal. We must understand that India and Nepal share historical bondage as countries, as people, including the demography. So there is nothing that has suddenly cropped up. What has cropped up is the issue of the Prime Minister's popularity. When I say so, it's a Nepalese Prime Minister's popularity within his party line and the country that we've been observing, the world has been observing for some time now. Earlier, we all know, this is not any hidden secret, that India and Nepal used to resolve matters amicably through mutual talks. Now, since of some time, quite of late, Nepal has tried to resolve its own issues through China, which they are free to do so. But by virtue of this, if Mr. Prachand and Mr. Oli, who came in together in order to be, and I would clearly say to function on behest of China within that country, it's their choice, their land, their country. But I maintain, India maintains that any difficulty of borders, any difficulty of administration can be only and only resolved through talks.
Okay. So Mr. Verma, I have a question here. So, obviously, Nepal being a sovereign country, its government has to decide how it has to, address its affairs. But as far as this particular issue is concerned, so India built a road, and this is for trade with China. As a matter of fact, one of the things that the Nepalese are saying is that, while India says that Nepal is leaning towards China, the Nepalese are saying that China and India are both in on something together, which belongs to Nepal. So Nepal is not really being backed by China on this.
Slightly disagree with this because Nepal, in this regard, may say whatever they have to, they are free to do so. But then when it comes up about building this road, we know about the Treaty of 1816 as well as the understanding of 1950, where it was about the approach road towards Mansarovar mutually agreed. But then that's not the pointer here. Showing aggression towards India will not help to any country in this world. Leave aside our brother Nepal. This is to be clearly understood.
So in that case, Mr. Verma, and I'm saying this as a neutral observer, So it's a sliver of land. And India is such a big country. I mean, if India, India should perhaps be generous with Nepal on this, no?
There's a difference between generous. There's a difference definitely being, demanded at a gunpoint. Now imagine sending forces by Nepal to the particular area that they are highlighting here is like showing a gunpoint to a country, which I am sure even a neutral observer such as you would not accept at all. Now, largely we must understand, and I would like to end my first comment here by saying that if this were the issue that Nepal was having as a boiling pot, where was Nepal while in 2014 India lent $1 billion credit line, $1 billion credit line to them? They did not highlight this. Where was Nepal while the Nepalese Prime Minister mocks India, rather insults India of spreading coronavirus in their country?
Let me go back to Mr. Dhakal here, because I'm also running out of time. Mr. Dhakal, one of the things that the Indians are saying that KP Oli has been under intense pressure from student groups and also parliamentarians, especially after India built that road. So they're saying a lot of this also has to do with the Nepalese domestic politics. So please respond to that, and also what Mr. Sharma said. Mr. Verma said.
Well, yeah. Yes, Ejaz, there is a context to it. It's not related only to, the internal political situation here in Nepal. Of course, the timing when the road has been inaugurated, the road has not yet been completed, but it is inaugurated in the middle of the COVID-19. That's why now is a very, very important question. But if you look at recent history since 2014, 15, and now, then, let's take into four major situations, four major points into account here. First, in 2015, May, China and India issue a joint communique from Xi'an, China, that they are going to build a road via Lipu Lake. Nepal immediately sends notes, diplomatic notes to China and India both.
Correct.
China responded. India did not say anything on that. India was quiet. Then Nepal has been asking, not only asking, Nepal has been requesting, diplomatic dialogue between the two countries for so many years. If you look at, joint communiques of the prime ministers of the two countries, every time Nepal has been requesting diplomatic negotiations, and it has been the subject of those joint communiques. Kalapani area and Susta area, these are two major areas of dispute between the two countries, and the joint communiques have been saying that the two countries will immediately sit for diplomatic negotiations, and those negotiations are never happening despite the fact that Nepal has been requesting them time and again. That is 2015. And then comes last November 2019. November, India issues a map showing Kalapani and also the Tri-Junction, Lipu Lake, and Lipu Lake and Limpiadura, the triangle, sorry, not the Tri-Junction, the triangle, the Himalayan land. And then in the middle of that, when there is a protest here in Nepal, of course, student groups were protesting because of that, and suddenly there comes a statement from
Nepal considered this as an attack on its sovereignty. I have unfortunately run out of time entirely, but thank you so much, Mr. Nishant Verma, Mr. Tika P. Dhakal. This is all from Indus Special this week. I would have said Happy Eid to the viewers wherever they are, but unfortunately, given the tragedy of an air crash earlier today, it makes one really sad. Our prayers are with those who have departed and also their families. It's a terrible tragedy, and it makes all of us very sad. So we have to spend this Eid knowing and thinking about those who are no more with us because of this crash. We shall see you next Thursday at the same time. For latest updates, you can follow us on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.